Okay, so hi, my name is Nick Gamso. I'm here with Andrew Witt. We're both writers interested in photography in California and lots of other things too, politics, cities, and so on. And we're talking about The Deaths in Newport by the great photographer Lewis Baltz, which is closing this week at Gallery Luisotti in LA. And maybe just like a second of background, the subject is a departure from Baltz's other work. It's a kind of archival photo essay telling the story of this sensational overall murder trial in Newport Beach in 1947. And the centerpiece is a 60-minute video that includes still images that was based on the original work that Baltz created in the 1990s, which was on CD-ROM. And so the gallery has transformed this and it's installed there along with photographs, a mounted copy of the text that Baltz wrote for the piece, and a lot of other materials too. So it's a digressive and
Mm.
odd in the best way project. And I wondered, Andrew, if you could just say a little bit about Baltz and his background and so on.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Nick. The one thing I would say about this piece, it is like very much an anomaly
Yeah.
in Baltz's career. Um, and, and it's an anomaly for a variety of reasons. I think like Baltz is like well known for his photographs of new industrial parks, tract houses, these landscapes, these new landscapes that were like sprouting up across the American West. And this work is very much a departure from that. And it starts, it's propelled through this first person personal voice, the very personal voice that like Baltz, writes this essay, like you said, it's like the video essay, but it writes this essay about his return to his hometown, Newport Beach, a town that he grew up in, cut his teeth as a photographer, a very young photographer. But he also frames it as like part of a crisis, right? He starts the essay, you know, talking about how his relationship was falling apart to his partner, and very much it's about this, he's based in Paris, moves to Milan. Paris is like he's dissatisfied with Paris, dissatisfied with Milan. His partner wants to return to Los Angeles, and there's this opportunity to photograph around the campuses. I believe you see Irvine, and so Baltz returns, but he's like, I hate Los Angeles, I hate Newport Beach, and upon this return, he starts you know thinking about what projects he can start like working on to occupy his time. And Newport Beach Art Museum was, in the process of constructing a new building in the neighborhood in which he grew up. And Baltz, being a photographer of again the buildings, architecture,
Right.
he thought that it was okay. I can maybe at this point document the construction of this new building. And like immediately he's like, no, actually, like I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to like engage with this type of work. Um, and and instead, it's interesting how he talks about like working on this project, because I forget the exact wording, but it feels as though he's just drifting. He drifts into this like thing. He's like, oh, I remember this trial, this very famous trial in 1947. And my father was, one of the star witnesses in this murder trial. And he's like, okay, maybe I can start, I'll do a project on this trial, this very scandalous trial, where two young lovers decide to, there's a trial over the fact that they, blew up this family boat, killing this woman's parents, the 17-year-old's parents, with dynamite. Um, and he's like, okay, this is the project I want to work on, which is like such a departure from Baltz's career and Baltz's work. Um, yeah, I wonder if you wanted to talk about the trial in particular, but yeah, that's like, I would say that's the genesis, is like being both dissatisfied with his own personal state of affairs, not wanting to work in this mode that he's been identified with, and then deciding to go in a different direction.
Yeah, there's a great in the Archives of American Art interview with Baltz from I think 2009. He says something like, "I started to rethink what might constitute a site.
Mm,
Maybe there's a social fabric, a community," he says, or the history of that place. And yeah, that's in a lot of his work, but I guess it surfaces a bit differently in this example. And he even says that his impulse to sort of depart from his more familiar practice was that he felt like he had solved a lot of the problems, addressed maybe
mhm.
I would say a lot of the problems in that space. So I mean, yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
And I was just going to piggyback on that thought too. It's like, so this is, around he returned. When does he return? Like 89, 90, like around that period. And I never write this in the essay, the accompanying essay to the exhibition, but 89 is like a lot of museums were celebrating the 150th anniversary of photography, the birth of this medium, and so there's all these different iterations and attempts to historicize the medium. And he's like, oh, I was also dissatisfied with how photography is talked about and how it's historicized. And, I think so. He's both dissatisfied with his own practice, but also dissatisfied with how photography is being thought of, talked about. And it's around also this time too, where he's working on, a mid-career retrospective that eventually is shown at the LACMA in '92, between I think the dates of like March, like later March 26th to like May or June 1st or so. We can put the dates in the liner notes of this
Yeah.
video, but so he's also like working on this retrospective, rethinking his own work, and he's like, okay, I solved all the problems, and now I want to like go in this different direction. And so yeah, this excavation is excavation into his own personal familial history, but also a history to Newport Beach. So it's like oscillating between this private connection and very public trial that was like a huge trial at the time, 1947. It's like it's lasts how many like months, like
19
six,
months, I think. Or
oh yeah,
19
yeah,
weeks,
so
excuse me. So that's
19
about
weeks, yeah,
5 months.
19
Yeah.
weeks, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was on the front page or the second page of every major newspaper at the time, like that, like Times, the Herald Examiner, the Hearst paper, and it's like Life magazine. This is very much captivating public attention. All the while, like Baltz, 1947, Baltz is barely a
Alive.
year old,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So, and yeah, so I wonder if you wanted to
Yeah,
take
totally.
some
I mean, it
time
is
to
interesting.
to
I was
describe the
appreciative.
trial and
Yeah.
and and
Yeah, I
what
mean,
happened.
I definitely, a lot of it is in the piece. Like if, the viewers of this video then are able to watch the piece or read, I think that there was like a text that was published separately. But he talks about it as being a media event,
Mm,
a real sensation. And as you say, it was, in all of the major papers. I think it was the longest trial in American criminal history at that time. Uh,
mhm.
and it was also broadcast on the radio, and these sort of gawkers and tourists came from all over. And in the piece there's this great, maybe we can even see an image of it, there's this great photo of, I guess, a secretary from Florida who shows up in like
Mhm.
her swimsuit and high heels and says, I'm here for the show and everything. And I was thinking as you were talking about the kind of intellectual currency of LA and photography at that moment, it was also, it seems to me like this kind of discovery of Los Angeles in the realm of critical theory as well, and semiotics. And that's sort of all over this case, as it is in a lot of Baltz's work. But he talks about, actually in the piece, he talks about UC Irvine as being this sort of center of continental theory in the US at that moment. And one thing I really liked in your essay is I mean, I'm very interested in the personal aspects, and I guess I
Mm.
maybe we can return to that in a minute. But something I really liked in your piece was the way that you talked about, the trial is of course constituted by evidence, and his photos have that quality as well. They're forensic investigations of a sort. So maybe, although it's anomalous in many ways, there are some continuities with his larger project. I don't, could you speak to that a little?
Yeah, I think there's like one way to, I think, historicize Baltz's practice is he's very much a product of the late 60s and early 70s. Um, and figures, tens like San Francisco Art Institute, and figures like Edward Weston, like looms large, Ansel Adams, and like the myth of like these photographers. And so he's really like developing his practice when like there's like counterculture, right? Happening, like the counter hippies counterculture in San Francisco in this like, early moment, anti-war, decides to go to school to avoid the draft, right? Um, and a lot of artists actually do this, like other artists in San Francisco like Mike Mandel, Larry Sultan, these people who are like the culture is very much like they're working against this like tendency. And so like this is a circuitous answer, but Baltz is, there's a moment in his like early career, he goes out to, Carmel, Monterey, throughout like the outskirts of San Francisco and tries to photograph, nature in a similar way of like Weston and others. And he's like, it utterly fails. He's like, I can't. But then at the same moment, he's, like photographic culture of that moment is like, photographing people on the street, Janis Joplin, like a cool photographer was someone who like photographed a cool subject. But Baltz decides to do something else. Like he's working more in the style of, say, like, Ed Ruscha, photographing these industrial buildings around, 74, 75. He's looking at, the landscapes around Irvine, his hometown, and he's kind of like horrified to what's happening, how these new industrial parks are being constructed, transforming paradise, right? This area around California, this paradise into like New Jersey, right? He talks about like how, and he's horrified by this transformation. But like as a photographer, his whole method is like not to rail against it and produce some sort of like dogmatic text, but he's like, oh, I'm going to work in this evidentiary mode and build a legal brief, like bit by bit, piece by piece, showing how, like, presenting the facts, just the facts, right? And I think that's the early iteration of like Baltz's forensic or evidentiary mode, because he thinks about his practice very much in this way. And so one way we can think about that early work, photographs these new industrial parks, is through this kind of constructing an evidentiary record. But then in this other iteration, Deaths in Newport, he's working with like the material culture, all this like these images that were produced around the trial. So like produced by police officers, investigators, produced by the local tabloids, the newspapers, and calling through this evidentiary record, and doing that work of excavation, and then also presenting this record. But it's a record that's propelled, again, like I said, by this first person personal voice. Yeah. And he's always going back to like his own relationship, his relationship to his father. And you can think about like how his father was one of the star witnesses in this case. But his father wasn't, a medical professional. He was a mortician. Yeah. And then initially when I thought about like this project, I thought his father was the coroner, but it was just like an a mortician that just processed these bodies.
Yeah, I think he was
And
the first person to see. Yeah, I mean, he was almost just kind of used by the prosecution in a way as something of a dupe, as it turns out.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then there was another expert witness that was brought in to like show that the bodies of the overalls were like struck by a ball peen hammer, and like the defense I guess showed that it was, oh no, it was the explosion from like a piece of like shrapnel from the exploded dynamite. But in many ways, like when we talk about photographs being like used in this evidentiary mode, like the one thing I always return to is this line by Alan Sekula where he's like, oh no, like the courtroom is always a battleground of different fictions. Courtroom is a battleground of fiction. So it's like these different publics are like you mobilize an image. The image has like a certain like level of like truth content, but that truth is always like up for grabs.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
there's
then
a
Baltz is kind of like alluding to this like this quality.
yes. Yeah, there's a really powerful moment in the piece where he talks about the prosecutors circulating photos of the father, Mr. Overell, who his was really mutilated actually, and his daughter, the 17-year-old, is sort of caught up in this. She's like staring at the photograph, and it's to your point about the conflict of fictions and also the kind of uses and abuses of the evidentiary trace. I mean, it's all over this, and yeah, it does seem that that's something he was certainly interested in. I mean, one other thing I was thinking when you were talking about his approach to Southern California is that he did rail against the kind of culture and social fabric of Southern California. And actually, there's a great quote of his that I think appears in your piece where he talks about just absolutely detesting, Orange County and Newport, and feeling like, especially in the decades when he was growing up, it was the site of, I think he said, waves of bulimic capitalism, and just this like horrible excess of overdevelopment. And it seems like that crosses into the realm of media in not in, I mean, his work is obviously very sort of consciously made, fastidious, careful, austere in many ways. But this case is, completely different. There's so much copy, so many salacious headlines and photographs in the tabloids, and yeah, and then within the courtroom itself. I mean, one piece that I wrote about in this short essay about this piece for Dear Dave is the photograph of his father, who was described in the press as like a dapper mortician, and is wearing this beautiful pinstripe suit, and I think is also described as like a square cut silvering man, and clearly Baltz is really like impressed with him, and this is when he goes on this sort of, oh, was I there in the courtroom, as a young baby? But almost a second later, it's all undercut, and his father is sort of humbled under cross-examination, and all of his methods are shown to be totally bogus.
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of uncertainty about Baltz's position, about his relationship to his father, who then died, I think, of cirrhosis of the liver, like 10 years later when Baltz was a young kid, basically. And that's looming over the whole thing. In my piece, I talk about like the suit, and the kind of like iconic status of the suit for like mid-century manhood, and talk about, Cary Grant and North by Northwest and all this stuff. And I think Baltz was, from what I have learned about him, like very conscious of that, was a dapper guy himself, a mortician of sorts, I guess you could say, based on his kind of affect. And so I think he was, I don't want to say exactly what he had in mind, but it seems like he was kind of circling these issues throughout. And, you could say he's performing like a parallel investigation on this photograph. But also that there's some, in the same way that it's this story about parricide, killing one's parent, he's engaged not exactly in parricide, but some kind of morbid reconstruction of his origins. He talks about a search for a secret past, for example. And actually, the piece begins and ends with these quotes from Freud discussing parricide by way of, I think, a Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky, yeah.
So it's a super, I mean, part of this is that like hard-boiled Chandler-esque voice that Baltz is using throughout, but I just am struck by all of this sort of crossover of themes, of materials, of the personal as well as the sort of social and political dimensions.
Yeah, I think that's like we can tail back to like, loop back to the earlier question about like the forensic as well. But like, I always struck by this quote by when Baltz was saying that like I think he was talking about the new industrial parks, but he's like, oh, I'm, trying to find like a vocabulary to mediate my sense of unspeakable horror at being born
Right, that's
when and where I was, right? So this unspeakable horror, right? And like, Newport Beach is like just like, I've never actually been, but been around that, the surrounding area, but it's like, it's like a very beautiful, nice. But it's also like, Newport Harbor, Newport Beach is like a base for the crypto fascist right?
right.
And he's
Yeah.
like, um, and but it's like also like where he grew up. And so like when he's saying that he's trying to find a language, a vocabulary to mediate his relationship to, this unspeakable horror is there's a sense of like hyperbole, but like, at the same time there's like the seriousness. And I think that finding that vocabulary is working in this like first person personal like voice where he's like dealing with this very public case that deals with parasites. So it's like the death of a father, but it's also like he's like working through the death of his own father. And he's like even says in his like when he returns to Los Angeles, he's like, oh, I reconnected with my old therapist in like Berkeley, California. And
Right.
so there's a sense where he's like, okay, now like we're getting serious about like, an analysis and like excavating these like family histories, and excavating the past. And the Freud, I always like had, some reservations about the quotes about Freud. And there's one about like the one's relationship to dreaming and how the dream is also this like I don't know like a unstable material which we like also misremember, right? We wake up and we also misremember, and when we try to reconstruct it, it's also like in an altered form. And so I think there's like he's hinting at there's a level of he's like winking at the reader or the viewer, saying that like okay, my account of this like story is also like riddled with like maybe like these different fictions.
Yeah, right.
The fictions of him saying that oh like in all likelihood I attended this trial as like a young toddler. But yeah, so that's like something to just think through, I think.
Yeah, it's a super sophisticated piece in that way. And actually, I've been thinking so much about true crime since reading your essay because, yes, it's extremely resonant with the obsession with true crime that is a part of popular culture now and has always been a part of journalism and tabloid journalism in particular. But yeah, this is a case where it's inconclusive. There's all of these questions running through it all that are irresolvable. And it seems like it's, I mean, I guess it's a Freudian archaeology of sorts, but it's also just a kind of a great, I don't know, an investigation without end. And it seems like that was
Mm.
also kind of part of his. I mean, that's when we're thinking about the relationship between documentary and landscape, like it is never ending. Transformations are constantly being made, whether it's through nature or these are man-made changes, which was, I think, one of the
Mm.
tenets of this new topographic movement. One of the images that really struck me in this piece was the photograph of the, I guess, intersection or address where Rodney King was assaulted. And it's a picture, I think the title is 111177 Foothill.
11777
Yes, okay.
Foothill
Foothill
Boulevard.
Boulevard, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I was um yeah, it's again, it's like somewhat baffling why he includes the work, but maybe we can unpack it a bit. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But it's the image is included very early in the CD-ROM like video essay when he speaks about his like I guess like again, horror or like it's general dissatisfaction, or just like, yeah, not wanting to return to LA and being like, just like, I guess, just, yeah. Anyways, um, the right word is kind of evading me, but he includes this photograph, um, but then doesn't talk about it, right? And this photograph was also the first image you saw during this retrospective, at LACMA, Rule Without Exception. Again, the dates between March and I think May. I actually have them written down. Do I have them written down somewhere? Yeah, so it's March 26th to May 31st, 1992. And this was the first image you saw when you walked into the exhibition. It was massive. It was really big. It was enormous reproduction. And again, like there's an LA Times interview that occurs around the opening of the show. And when Baltz talks about this photograph, he's like, oh, I just was commissioned to make a piece about LA, and I wanted to photograph a very generic location, unextraordinary, something that's like that could be found in 50 different other sites around Los Angeles. And he doesn't, tell the interviewer what this photograph depicts, or the fact that this is a site of historical rupture. And but yeah, so the photograph is a photograph of the site where Rodney King was beaten by 4 police officers, but it's not a depiction of the event. It's not a depiction of but it's like from the site looking outwards to the street. It's during daytime, and so none of these events would be directly observable in the photograph. And so I think in that, we can talk about that interview. I feel as though he's also messing with the reporter slightly, because he's like, oh, this is just an unextraordinary photograph. This is a banal, everyday image. But in fact, it's like part of it's like a defining moment in LA's history. The riots, so the exhibition starts around, March, like I said. And then this uprising, the rebellion, only occurs a month later in April, after the not guilty verdict. So, and I don't mention that in the essay, but it's like, so, but I think there was a little bit of like pushback from the curators about, the use of this image. But again, it's an image that, hints at this aspect of like violence, but it doesn't actually like show it either. I wondered if you had any thoughts on the even the inclusion.
It seems quite in keeping in a way with his practice, where he's showing you these seemingly banal sites, and then there's some kind of investigative work which might not even be stated or available to the viewer, or maybe a researcher or a writer has to come along and sort of make sense of it. I also think there's I guess a contrast in some ways with this case, because one of the things he says about this was that the prosecution so mishandled this case. He interviews a detective who worked on the case. In fact, he might have even been the sort of chief of police of Newport at that time. And that guy tells Baltz that even though he believes that these 2 young lovers did, yes, commit the crime, he agrees with the jury that they should be acquitted because the prosecutors so bungled the case. And in particular, this attorney general named Fred Hauser had used the case for kind of political propaganda, put himself in charge of the prosecution, which was quite, I guess, sort of inappropriate. And he was then called to the stand by the defense. So it became this sort of critique of the criminal justice system in a way, and it won. And he also talks about the acquittal, and he says this was possibly because it was a working class jury, and there was a working class Newport Beach that was, against the police in a way, against law and
Mm.
order, against the Overells, certainly, who were this very wealthy family. So I think that there's some connections possibly drawn there, although it's hard to, to say definitively what those connections are beyond just putting these two, the parataxis, putting these two events one after the other and trying to
Mm.
make sense of um, not so much what had changed historically, but these continuities across time.
Yeah, I think initially the way I was like introduced to Baltz was actually through Alan Sekula, and I've written a lot about Sekula's work, and he's Baltz even calls him Sekula an adversary, like in some of his interviews. But because Sekula wrote a very early review of Baltz's New Industrial Parks, and how Sekula quotes Benjamin quoting Brecht about the photo, this like very common cliched line that Benjamin, I think, cites in the Low History of Photography, where he's like, "Oh, the photographs of these factories, the crop and AEG factories, tell us nothing about the social relations that take place within these sites." And he's like, so Sekula cites this line as in a way a critique of Baltz's photographs of these new industrial landscapes, and he's like, oh, actually, like a similar sentiment can be like thought through when we speak to these images, but in a way, like that's part of the truth of these new industrial like spaces, is that they're supposed to like camouflage, and they're supposed to like look all the same. They're these sites, which is building and constructing the new weaponry of like at the time the Vietnam War, conflict across like Southeast Asia, and so, but then at the same time, there's that famous line by Walter Hopps, which Baltz cites, is like, you don't know whether these buildings are manufacturing pantyhose or megadeth, right? And so I think that's part of the point, is the aspect of these buildings are supposed to like camouflage their purpose. And so there's an aspect of like I think with this photograph 1177 Foothill Boulevard, Baltz is also putting a lot of the onus on the viewer slash historian to also like think through how we like deal with history. This is like, this site is the site of a historical rupture, historical violence. The violence is not present, is like disappeared, but how do we think through that event and deal with this event, and how do we historicize it? And photography is inadequate in showing that like that violence, but in fact it's like the onus is put on the historian to do that work of excavation, to tell us, like, to take this image of like nothing, a very unextraordinary banal place, and be like, oh, this is and actually point and be like, this is the site of a historical rupture in like, yeah, in Los Angeles.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that strikes me is that I guess after he had proposed like a version of this project, it was not realized. To the, and you said this at the beginning, like the kind of occasion for this was a commission for the new Newport Harbor Museum, I think is what it was called.
Yeah.
Then they rejected his proposal on the grounds that the case was, from my vantage, the case seems kind of quaint,
Yeah,
sort of out of
yeah,
our time. And this
yeah.
was 3 years ago, but they said, no, it's still too raw
Yeah.
for this community. I don't think we should do it. And it's an interesting comment, both because it suggests that, yes, there was something about the case that was, maybe it was the class dynamics, or maybe it was the role of the police that was still fresh in the minds of people living in Newport. But it was also like a sort of, I interpret this as a statement on Baltz's part about the photography world at that time being content with the cosmetic function of photography rather than the more investigative dimensions of it. So there's a kind of institutional critique that finishes the piece.
Yeah, it's certainly
Also,
not like a, because that was like his whole thing, is like there's this convention for photographers at the time to create this like monumental like photographic document of like the construction of a new building. And then this is like a monument of a different sort. It's like it's, more of a scandalous
yes.
like story and account. Yeah.
Yeah. And that
Uh,
also marks his departure from, I mean, the piece ends really beautifully with him just, I think the last word is Paris, as in I returned to Paris and, resumed my life in the intellectual sphere of Europe and, left behind in Southern California. And so I think he was in that way, maybe, putting his finger on something, this thing that he really just could not in his whole life, even though California was the subject of so much of his work. This issue that we've been talking about here over whether his photographs were really saying something or they were part of the work of obscuring the reality of our economy in California and the war economy and so on. So I think it was like he was saying, enough of all that and planning to sort of move on with the rest of his
yeah.
life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do
Hmm.
you want to add anything or
I feel there's always like more to
there's so
add,
much to
but
this piece, it's really
yeah,
rich. Yeah.
it's a nice actually place to end, I think. The Unless you had any more thoughts on, um it's a nice conclusion in a way. I'm trying to think.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing that we could talk a little bit about are the photos by Tara Konyak.
Kind of get.
But I don't know if we necessarily need to go into those. I mean, uh, yeah,
Yeah, no, I think the one thing when I circulated this, the one thing to say too is, reading these interviews about Baltz, and this happens like to a lot of photographers or just even artists in general, is like, there's a sense that like, okay, so this is a work that was produced in 1995. Um, and it's such a like rare piece. It's like it's also like rarely shown. Um, and it's like in a way like the 30th anniversary of like, well, the public presentation in Los Angeles. Um, but it's a work that, yeah, again, it's quite rare. But then there's a sense that too that like Baltz is like is the touchstone to so many photographers and artists, from like Catherine Opie to Kranyak, other artists. And we shared this piece, the Lewis Baltz true crime newspaper,
yes, yeah, lovely. Yeah.
Tyler Green, and you know, um, who's the host of the Modern Art Notes podcast, and he's like, one of the artists that always comes up as like an influence is Baltz. Aside from Matisse and Picasso, it's like Baltz is always a touchstone. And the new topographics show in the Eastman House Museum from 1975 is also this like kind of defining moment in photography, and it's such influential to a lot of like younger kind of cohort of photographers. But it's also like somewhat peculiar how that exhibition and Baltz's work is so influential, because that new topographics show was, barely, like, not many people saw it. It was shown in Princeton, Eastman House first, and Princeton in the summer. Of course, Baltz is like represented by, Leo Castelli, and he has like this like, um, you know, uh, at the time, like, quite a distinguished like career. But it's kind of peculiar to me how the new topographic show and Baltz's work also, you know, took on such like power, and influence. Aside from the fact that, maybe the catalog circulated hand to hand, between people. But yeah, the Tara Kranyak work is interesting because she visits a lot of the sites where Baltz had photographed, but places herself in the picture. And she documents how some of these, new industrial buildings had been turned also into like, evangelical churches.
Right.
um, and there's yeah, so that's like something to, I don't know if that's like worth discussing or talking about, but um
Yeah, I mean, the whole we have alluded to, I guess, some contemporary issues that I think are, you can't not think about when you're looking at some of his work, like the ice detention centers that are being built, or these sort of new armaments around the border. And of course, there's a lot of photographers documenting those and other artists who are kind of thinking with those spaces. Also, just questions of, I mean, I don't know if this is something maybe you talk about a bit in your book, but the surveillance dimension of photography, and certainly in California, where there's this huge buildup of kind of military industrial sites. I mean, Trevor Paglen obviously has done a lot of work on these, but I feel that that's Baltz adjacent. Maybe not to this particular project, but it seems resonant.
Yeah, no, and especially like you see that, like certainly also when you drive, like when I visited Gallery Luisotti before this exhibition, drove out, I think around Huntington Beach. And yeah, like you see, that was like one of the first instances where I came in contact with um, these buildings that Baltz, like similar buildings to what Baltz photographed, and they are like these like terrifying structures, right? And it's like completely alien, and it's like there's an aspect to these yeah, this architecture which is like slightly horrifying, but also like, yeah, it's imposing, and it's like, oh, these are the same buildings which like Lockheed or Boeing or are like constructing like these new machines of like death, right? And it's like, okay, that you have that anyways, but
Yeah.
and that's also California's history. That's like very much like you go into the desert, it's like these structures are like scattered throughout the desert, but also scattered throughout the outskirts of Irvine, Huntington Beach,
Yeah, and
and
so
something
much
to
of
like,
so much of the wealth in California is from those kinds of activities, as well as extraction and so forth. So, I mean, especially being, I think about this in the Bay Area as well, just the extent of the sort of tech military buildup there since World War II is, really responsible for a lot of its expansion. I mean, the atomic bomb was built, in Berkeley, among these scientists who lived in really beautiful arts and crafts style homes in the Berkeley Hills. I mean, there's all of this sort of occlusion. And I feel that the discourse in Los Angeles has something of a vocabulary for this, which is actually in the sunshine noir paradigm that, captures really well in this piece. And I think very consciously. And even I think the very first image is like some bougainvilleas that look really beautiful, so I feel that, yeah, maybe in LA there's a way of kind of grappling with this. I see it much less often in the Bay Area, which is so kind of obsessed with its own progressive history and so on.
and this one, when you bring up like this aspect of critical theory earlier, like I think what better voice to historicize this change, but or even to like think through it, is through the voice of the noir
Yeah, that's
detective, right? And Frederick Jameson is like, is like wrote a book on like Raymond Chandler, precisely like in this like okay, this is the way that we're able to historicize or theorize like these transformations in California. And maybe the best theoretical descriptions
that's right.
of LA is like through the writings of like someone like Raymond Chandler. And you also think of like, we bring up the Bay Area, like a work that's a little bit later to when Baltz is photographing the new industrial parks. A work made in 1977 by Mike Mandel and Larry Sultan, the book Evidence, which is like, it's it's a different type of excavation going to all of these different corporations, public and private, entities that were like up and down the California coast that were part of like the military industrial complex.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and going into their photo archives and excavating these images of like scientific experiments, and just like also like I think they visited the archives of like the fire and police department, and they built this archive which they then eventually turned into this photo book evidence of, which is like a history of the state of California, but it's like also there's no accompanying essay or text or history. It's like, this book is very much placed in the hands of the viewer and they have to make sense of it. But if you look closely, like it's not just like a free floating excavation of like photo history, but like the book also has a very clear, trajectory. And it's like, okay, this technology leads to disaster, catastrophe,
Right. Yeah.
and like human suffering. And it's like a subtle, like it's a subtle message, but it's a message that like you can eventually pull out, despite the fact there's like no captions illustrating this like uh this like horrific transformation of like bodies and landscape and
Yeah.
but, yeah.
Yeah, another artist, I mean, this is really probably not for this conversation, but since we're just chatting about it, another person I've been thinking about through this is Bruce Conner. And I've been writing something about his films, and there's a big show of them at the Marciano Foundation in LA right now.
Right.
They're really beautifully screened there, and the sound is amazing and everything. But he was, I mean, he has his own trajectory. He was in New York first, and then came to California, kind of to get away from the commercial art world. But his films are full of there's some allusion to Hollywood and to the film industry and just moving image and montage and so on. But they're really about death and destruction, and in particular, Crossroads, the film about the atomic bomb. And so he was not just in California. He also did a lot of more like sort of transgressive, optimistic California work, like the sort of music videos that he made with Tony Basil and Dennis Hopper and so on. But that morbidity is a really strong element of his. And, I think there's a good chance, I'm not sure when he was teaching at SFAI, but I'm always trying to figure out when there was crossover there, So, and actually, Teresa told me, because I guess she studied photo there, that the film people and photo were really kept apart in those days, which is odd because I know that in the later time, I used to teach there, it was like everybody took every class because there was few students basically. But I don't know, I guess it's just a big part of California sort of art and image culture, is this violence running beneath things. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I just recall like when I was like reading up on Baltz too, like his time in San Francisco is like, like everyone hated my work, and there was like it just wasn't like well received, and I think that's just like, oh, some of these, how this practice is, yeah, it's like you think of work produced in the moment, which the audience is like perhaps like they're like sleepers in a way. They're not necessarily, it's not necessarily, the audience is like maybe not ready for it, or it's like a work that's like made for the future too. It's like,
that's right.
And like the work awaits a viewer for like in a different time and in a different moment. And I think that's certainly the case with the deaths in Newport too, especially in the the current fascination with the genre of true crime, right? Which is like very much like I think there's always been fascination, and the height of the noir genre, the time of Chandler is like that, very much the time of the overall murders, like late 40s, early 50s.
He has a moment where in the piece where he talks about it being the apex of the detective story, or he talks about the detective story as simulacrum or something, bringing together a lot of these discourses that we're working through. But,
yeah. but yeah, no, and then it's like, oh, but like look at our moment. It's like every streaming platform, every like podcast is obsessed with these moments of just like, yeah, it's whether horrific violence or there's a thirst for justice too, like the justice, like the prosecution or the police have like bungled the investigation, and you have these like citizen journalists like doing the real work to find a moment of like to seek justice in like this unjust
Yeah.
moment. But yeah,
Yeah, there's also like an obsession with, I think, with documentary and these archival practices, and also just with the past. And
yeah,
trying to, it's like any of these, there's been so many true crime books published over the last, 75 years. And hardly any of them have stood the test of time, like In Cold Blood, there's so many. And so when someone is able to like reconstruct, I think this is what some of those podcasts are devoted to, is like reconstructing these old cases that, no
yeah,
one's even still alive from. So it is in that way, it's almost like how this, honestly, in a way, that's how this piece functioned for me. When I first sat down to read your essay, I didn't know anything about the overall
yeah,
murders or the case which followed. So that was sort of my first thought about it, was, wow, this is interesting and worth paying attention to. And it was only later, like on a second viewing and thinking more about it, that I was able to sort of maybe understand some of the more subtle and sophisticated
mm.
kind of, I guess, critique that Baltz was using. Yeah. So it's really, really rich piece. It's so cool that they resurrected it in this way.
Yeah. And I think one thing I would say is like this is like, yeah, Baltz's work is like it's important that this work is being shown, especially like since it's like so rare, and but it's like Baltz really deserves a major like retrospective and
Yeah, yeah.
an account. And the Getty has like I think most of the archive,
Mm.
um and like they're just sitting on the material. And it's like the same with like Alan Sekula and
Yes.
all of these like photo has like a privileged place in many of these institutions, but it's really time for like a larger account and retrospective of like you know Baltz's place. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, there was a great show a couple of years ago in San Francisco at the De Young Museum that was, it was the theme. I don't think this is the title exactly, but the theme was After Ansel Adams. And it was sort of talking about all these artists. I think there were some Lewis Baltz pieces. There were a lot of pieces, like, for example, Catherine Opie. I didn't know that she did landscape
mm,
photography,
yeah, going out to Yosemite and yeah,
Yes, yeah, it was really cool. I mean, it was super rich. It also helped me think more about Adams as being, a more sophisticated artist than maybe I had naively thought he was, because he was also doing a lot of work on, human landscapes and kind of borderlands and so on. But yeah, I feel like there's some hunger for this material. So hopefully someone makes a Baltz,
mm,
does the Baltz retrospective that we've been waiting for, whether it's
yeah.
at the Getty or somewhere else. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, this has been
Yeah.
great.
Well, yeah, it was nice chatting.
Yeah, totally. I really enjoyed, yeah, getting to think through this with you. So
Yeah.